Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Oh, Captain, my captain.
I'm telling you straight, it's my way or the highway.
Oh, command me, Lord. Now you want to get nuts? Come on, let's get nuts.
Tell me something, my friend. You ever dance with the devil in the pale moonlight? I always ask that of all my prey. I just like the sound of it.
I'll have what she's having.
You have chosen wisely.
It reminds us of all that once was good. And it could be again.
My calculations are correct. When this baby hits 88 miles per hour, you're gonna see some serious...
You're listening to the 30-something Movie Podcast. Classic movies, 30 years in the making. Hello and welcome to the 30-something Movie Podcast. This time around, we don't have a movie to talk about. Well, actually, we may end up talking about several movies, but we actually have an author that is here tonight, author and speaker, Kevin Smokler, who has graciously accepted an invitation to come on the show. So, Kevin, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, John, it's my pleasure. This is like my favorite thing in the world to do. So, so thanks for inviting me.
Well, and it's funny. We have a listener of our show also follows you on Facebook and Twitter. And I think they had mentioned our show to you. And I think at one point you thought you'd already been on the show.
Yeah, there's a good, I mean, there's an absolute bumper crop, like an embarrassment of riches of great podcasts about movies from the past. And unfortunately the names are all too similar, you know?
Right.
So if you're in the course of book touring and you're on like the flashback movie podcast, but also the like 80s flashback movie podcast, you start to lose track of which one it is. That makes me sound like a horribly arrogant person who just spends his days hopping around and listening to people talk about the things he does. But, no, it was actually an honest yet embarrassing mistake, but I'm glad we rectified it.
Not embarrassing for us because we got you on the show. So
I'm glad it worked out. And
it worked out.
And I dig the concept of your program, so I'm interested to hear where we take this.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was kind of funny. We started the show about 4 years ago, and most of the guys that are on the podcast together, we all teach at the same school. There's one guy that works one other place, but
no kidding.
We're all teachers. We used to just hang out during our lunch period in the teachers' lounge, and while everybody else is complaining about the kids, we're all sitting there and we're talking about, you know what? I think Ghostbusters might be the best movie of 1984. No, you're crazy. And we were just kind of the nerd table that the rest of the teachers would ignore while they're trying to have their salad and their vitamin water and complain about the kids. And we're over there, debating which of the Ghostbusters is best and what's your favorite horror movie and all that stuff. So we kind of decided, you know what? We had talked a little bit about starting a podcast, and we said, why not? And we realized, I think we'd been talking so much back in it was probably about 2015. We'd been talking so much about how many great movies there were in 1984 and 1985. So we're like, yeah, man, perfect concept. Let's do one where every year we go in and we look at stuff that's reaching its 30th anniversary. So it's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun. And
you guys were meant to find each other, it sounds like.
Yeah. But you're right. There is an overabundance of movie podcasts, much less 80s movies podcasts. So
I'd be out of a job if there wasn't. So I'm glad you guys exist.
Absolutely. Well, for the benefit of our listeners, at the start of every episode, I do let the listeners know that we are a spoiler podcast. So if we start to talk about a movie, if you hear the name of a movie and you're like, I haven't seen it yet, I don't want to hear anything about it, then you may want to skip ahead just a little bit on your podcast player, because we let the spoilers flow. So I think most of the movies that we end up talking about, they've been around for quite a while. So if you haven't seen them yet, maybe this is your way of getting introduced to it. And we'll try not to ruin too much for you, but just be aware that if we start to talk about a movie, if we mention a title, it's everything is open and fair game. So just listeners be aware of that. If you have not left us a review on iTunes, if you've listened to the show before, and if you're enjoying the show, please leave us a review on iTunes. That would be great. So we kind of have a sense of what you're enjoying about the show. And it's just a great way to let us know, what we're doing right. And if we're doing something wrong, let us know that too. That's totally cool. And then finally, visit our website, 30podcast.com. Is a great way to get to all of our social media spots. And then Kevin, we'll mention yours at the end of the show, so folks that are listening can go find you if they haven't found your Twitter and your website and all that other stuff. So we'll get them pointed in your direction as well.
Superb.
Awesome. So usually kind of one of the ways we start out the show is we kind of look at any of our social media interactions we've had before we jump into what we're talking about. We do a little movie news if we've got any. And so the only thing that really has come up is something that has come up within the last few days, and it kind of blends the news and the social media stuff together. We've had some of our followers, and I think they're all friends with each other outside of maybe listening to the show. They've gotten into a little bit of a debate over Zack Snyder coming out and saying that Ben Affleck is the best Batman. So had you heard this? Have you weighed in on this at all? Do you care?
No, I don't care, and it doesn't surprise me because Zack Snyder seems to live on sort of a volume setting much larger than the rest of us, and I think it's indicative in his movies, and it's indicative in some of the crazy things he says. He did make a great. Didn't he make that? He made that fantastic documentary about the Atari, though, right?
I believe so. Yeah. I do like. I enjoyed Man of Steel. Thinking of some of his movies that he's made, I enjoyed 300. I enjoyed Man of Steel, and then it just kind of things seemed to go a little off the rails once we got past that point.
Yeah, like I can't say I'm too invested in who is the best Batman and who isn't, because I feel like the Batman franchise kind of rises and falls based on its villains. Batman is. I mean, there are different ways of doing it. Adam West is not George Clooney, is not Michael Keaton, is not Val Kilmer, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't know. Like I always feel like which Batman you like depends upon like what Batman stirs in your soul. Like is Batman supposed to be campy and stupid and sort of very 60s go-go bootish? Then Adam West is your favorite Batman. Is Batman supposed to be dark and gothic? Then like Michael Keaton is your favorite Batman. Is it supposed to be, gaudy and colorful and Joe Schumacher like? Then Val Kilmer is your favorite Batman. And all of those are independent of the person who plays Batman. It's more the person who interprets Batman.
Right. I almost think of it as a little bit like the argument over James Bond. Your favorite James Bond is probably the one that you grew up with.
Yeah.
My mother-in-law is a huge Sean Connery fan, and for all his campiness, I love Roger Moore.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great article 1,000 years ago that Anthony Lane, the movie critic for the New Yorker, did about James Bond, where he made the point that even though when James Bond came out, it was this very like mid-century British Empire kind of thing, the will of Britain being, restoring order to the rest of the world, like for a long time, for like 75% of James Bond history, there was only one Englishman who played like the most English of fictional characters. And everybody else was from, the English colonies and the provinces, which I think is kind of fascinating. The different ways of looking at James Bond. But yeah, I think I think it's who you grew up with and like what you're willing to stomach. I love the Sean Connery James Bond movies. They're also like appallingly misogynistic and racist, and like, so you gotta weigh that too.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I think that's pretty much all we had in terms of news and social media stuff. I kind of I glanced at that over the last day or so, and I was like, okay, we'll get a little mini debate going on here. We just did our episode just about a month ago on Batman '89. So I know that had kind of been a thing we had talked about just a little while ago. But so I haven't really kind of formally introduced you yet. So Our guest today is Kevin Smokler. He has authored or edited several books, including, and you can correct me if I get any of these wrong, we've got Bookmark Now, we've got The Customer is Always Wrong, we've got Practical Classics, 50 Reasons to Reread 50 Books You Haven't Touched Since High School, and then Brat Pack America. Did I get all those right?
The Customer is Always Wrong is an anthology I appeared in. It was edited by my great friend Jeff Martin.
Okay.
But that's an anthology. The rest of them are all mine.
Okay, I knew you had one essay in there. I wasn't sure if you were involved in any editing or anything like that, but okay. And you're a regular presenter. Do you also still host at South by Southwest? I thought I saw that you had been a host on one of their.
Yeah, I used to host their live storytelling show, which was called Frey Cafe, and I was on their advisory board for many, many years. While I was writing Brat Pack America, I had to take a break from going to conferences, so I stopped my South by Southwest responsibilities
Sure.
at that point, which was a few years ago.
Sure. You can't multitask and write a book and do all that at the same time?
I've never been particularly good at that, and maybe it was because Brat Pack America involved watching 55 movies from the 1980s, each one at least 3 times. It was a lot of time at home that year and a half.
Absolutely. Well, and I didn't realize until because I've read Brat Pack America, and I had seen the Practical Classics one, and I need to read that one. I didn't realize that nearly everything you've worked on is something that I need to be reading. Between being a former English teacher, I still work in the schools, but I'm not a classroom teacher anymore. But being a former English teacher, having worked retail jobs, being an 80s movie fan, I'm looking at all your books and I'm just like, yeah, I need to go get all these. So
you're the person.
Everything. I'm your demographic.
You're the person I had in mind. That's fantastic, John.
So I wanted to start off with have you kind of talk a little bit about some of this. I should mention that you've also spent a little bit of time kind of up in our neck of the woods in the northern suburbs of Chicago. You did that for Brat Pack America when you were covering the Shermer chapter of the book. And you were a resident at the Ragdale House. Was it twice, I believe?
3 times. Yeah.
3 times. Okay. And I recognized that immediately. I think you and I might have talked a little bit on Twitter a couple times about that. My wife used to visit there fairly regularly because she had gone to Lake Forest College when she was an undergrad.
Oh, sure.
And she worked in the library and worked with one of the local historians and archivists that worked at the college library. And they were constantly doing tours of the estates and giving tours of Ragdale. And so as soon as I heard that you had done that, I thought, okay, I know exactly where that is. You've been in my hometown. So for anybody who doesn't know, what exactly is Ragdale? What was it like staying there?
The Ragdale is a old mansion in Lake Forest, Illinois, that was built by a famous architect, I believe, at the turn of the century. And since the 1970s, it's been a nonprofit artist residency / community arts organization for the city of Lake Forest and for the region at large. For artists, i.e., writers, filmmakers, actors, theater directors, choreographers, they have a residency program where you apply, and if you are accepted, you are given a 2 and 3 week term to simply come, and work on your discipline while you're there. And they feed you dinner, and you eat leftovers from dinner for breakfast and lunch, and you spend time with your fellow artists. And it's really a very special place. And there are these kinds of programs all over the country. Most of them are not in somewhere as nice as Lake Forest or as nice as the Ragdale House. And I'm not really a middle of nowhere person, so I liked being able to put in a good week's work at Ragdale, and then get on the train on Saturdays and go visit my best friend in Chicago. So it's really a very special place. It's the ideal artist residency as far as I'm concerned, and I'm just hoping they keep taking me.
Yeah. So the 3 times you stayed there, was that when you were working on Brat Pack America?
The most recent time was at the end of my the Brat Pack America tour, which went on for a year and a half. And then before that, it was working on Practical Classics. And then before that, it was between Bookmark Now and Practical Classics. So no, I actually, strangely enough, I did not work on Brat Pack America while at Ragdale in the northern suburbs of Chicago. When I came to research and report Brat Pack America, I stayed in Chicago with my friends there, many of whom had grown up in the northern suburbs, and I had them schlep me around to, Glencoe and Evanston and places like that where key moments in 80s teen movies had taken place, and I benefited from their expertise.
Yeah. I was just curious because I know you had come to, I think it was the Northbrook Public Library. It was a couple years ago, and I had fully intended to get there and see if I could talk to you for a minute there, because I had started reading your book, and I think either one of my kids got sick or something. I'm like, oh man, I missed my chance, and I think I sent you a note, and that's when you mentioned when I mentioned I was in Lake Forest, you mentioned Ragdale. I thought, well, I know exactly where that is. But how did you end up finding Ragdale? I mean, because you're right now you're in San Francisco.
Yeah, I've been in San Francisco almost 20 years, even though I'm originally from the Midwest, and proudly so. I had a friend who I'm friends with several writers in Chicago. There's an incredible literary and journalistic community in Chicago, and one of them had gone to Ragdale, and I didn't know what it was, and I only dimly had an idea of what a writer's residency was, and so I just asked her some dumb questions, and she said, "Oh, Ragdale's fantastic, and this is why." And I said, "Well, sounds perfect." And so I applied soon after.
Now, is that something where when you're doing your writing, you're doing research, your work, is that kind of your ideal spot, is to be able to have a place where you can just sit and focus and work? Because I know the other side of that, one of our other guys who's a co-host on the podcast sometimes, he's a teacher. He's got 2 kids that are in high school, so he's got very little time to write, but he teaches a digital film class at our school.
That's cool.
He's always wanting to write his own screenplays.
Mm-hmm.
And he's had a chance to be to kind of be involved in some very local movies kind of up here around Milwaukee a little bit. And he and I actually were extras. Our scene got cut. We were extras in The Dark Knight.
Oh, that's great.
So I got to have a lot of fun. Even though we weren't in the movie much, we got to see the behind the scenes stuff.
Yeah.
But his thing is he applied for it. I don't think he got it, but I'm pretty certain he applied for the opportunity to do one of those trips where you go on the train and you take the train from Chicago to New York. And is something like Ragdale, is that the best way for you to do your work, or are you just kind of happy wherever you are?
The opportunity to do nothing but your work is an unparalleled luxury that almost none of us have. And I'm a person of, I make a decent living and I don't have any kids, and I can carry my job around with me in a backpack. So yes, I could do more of that, but I just don't think that's realistic. And it also, it potentially creates bad habits. I don't want to be the kind of person who is so precious about my writing that I can only do it in ideal circumstances like that. Even Thoreau walked into town and had his mother do his laundry. He wasn't hanging out at Walden for 2 straight years without any human contact. And so as such, I feel like if I'm going to do this professionally, and I'm going to be dead and buried before I'm done with all the books I want to write. I need to be a little bit more low touch than that. And I need to be able to just set up and do it. And so every writer has their requirements of sort of the basic things they need in order to be productive that day. And mine are, a playlist that I've listened to for the last 15 years when I'm writing, and a pair of earphones and a mug of iced coffee, decaf these days. But, that's pretty much all I need. And it's taken me a long time to find a method that's portable and where I can just kind of set up and do it. But that is really what's required if you want to do it with any consistency.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Yeah, well, I just was curious to hear a little bit more about that, because I live in the same town as Ragdale, but I've never been myself, and I've only heard from other people. Yeah, it's just a place where artists and writers hang out. Well, there's got to be more to it than that.
Yeah, they do great community events, that are moderately priced and of high quality, and the grounds are just stunning. It's 100%. It's 100% worth your time.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I wanted to ask you, since I got you here, and you've written the book on Brat Pack America, and how geography and locations are so vital to what makes a lot of those movies what they are. And we are an 80s podcast. I had some questions I was going to kind of throw at you in terms of kind of 80s movies in general, maybe a little bit related to 80s teen movies. So one of the things that we talk about pretty regularly on the show is, since we're looking back at movies that are reaching their 30th anniversary, we're always kind of asking ourselves whether or not the movie still holds up. And I think one of the things that maybe we still need to work on a little bit is, what is our definition of what it means for a movie to hold up? When you think of movies, I mean, you've watched a lot of 80s movies in the last few years.
Sure have, yeah.
What would be your definition of how a movie holds up over time for you?
God, that's a really good question. A little anecdote. My middle brother for my birthday in August sent me the first 3 seasons of L.A. Law on DVD. I don't know how in the world he knew I was craving such a thing, but I was very impressed that he figured that out because it's been a long time. In fact, I don't think it's ever been like formally released on DVD until now. So I've been watching those, and I get that question a lot, like how well does it hold up? And the truth is, like, if I'm being fair and I'm not just like making snap judgments based on like the bad haircuts and the shoulder pads and the fact that everybody's talking on a corded phone and that Blair Underwood is all of 25 years old, the it holds up pretty well for what it is, which is that it was a nighttime drama on broadcast television in the days when there was only broadcast and cable. Like there wasn't anything else. I mean, there was HBO and Showtime, but those were movie channels back then. So if you're asking the question, like, is LA Law as good a show as Breaking Bad? Like, that's not a fair comparison. Like, we're in a totally different time in hour-long television drama now. But for like 1988 or 1986, when LA Law first went on the air, yeah, it holds up just fine. Like, still compelling, it's still fun, and it, for what it is, for the standards at which it had to operate under, it does pretty well. Movies are slightly different because, they're only 2 hours and they only kind of get one bite of the apple. So I usually judge it based on, like, am I still enjoying it for at least spiritually some of the same reasons as I was before? Like, I don't have a crush on Ali Sheedy the way I did when I was 13 and saw The Breakfast Club, like, not anymore. But I still am moved by that movie, like tremendously. Do I recognize the fact that, like, it doesn't cast any people of color and could have, and like it operates on some very sort of loose, sloppy stereotypes? Yeah, I get that too. It loses none of its power to me because of that. The movie it is nearly impossible for something to feel of its time and yet removed from the shackles of time. And the things that do that are on Mount Olympus. Like there's that is those are the things that are those are the milestones that carry on, long after all of us are gone. At the same time, like, I think I think there is a little bit of that in anything that endures and that we come back to. We come back to it in part because it reminds us of then, and because it still gives us something now. The things we snicker at, I did this when I was on tour. I would say to people, like, if I say the Spin Doctors, what do you do? And most people would snicker. And I would say, why are you snickering? And they would say some version of, because, like, I hear the Spin Doctors and I think 1993. And I'm like, yeah, and the poor Spin Doctors are stuck in 1993 forever, which is part of which is the definition of something that does not, quote, age well or hold up. I don't think that's the Spin Doctor's fault, quite frankly, but there we are. So I guess I would say this is a long way of saying the thing that holds up is the thing that reminds you of then, but doesn't only remind you of then.
Sure, absolutely. Well, and I will admit, as soon as you said Spin Doctors, I started humming Two Princes in my head.
Yeah.
So that holds up just fine for me.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. And to be fair to the Spin Doctors, like, some of that is just a question of when you come along.
Mhm.
Like, the Spin Doctors in 1993 feels like an artifact, like a musical bottle of Fruitopia or something.
Yeah.
But the Spin Doctors in 1973 is like, a baby Grateful Dead.
Yeah.
And they would probably have endured much longer, had they come along 20 years earlier.
Yeah, in fact, as soon as you said that, it made me think of I lived in England for a few years, and one of the very first places that I went to was a music store in the town that we lived in, and there was the first album I bought was one of those Now That's What I Call Music collections.
Oh, sure, man.
And I think it was Two Princes, I think was the Spin Doctors song that was on that. I destroyed that tape with the amount that I played it.
Yeah.
So.
Talk about something that's going to be around long after all of us are gone. Like they're going to be on Now Music 573, and we're all going to be, you know, buried in the ground and fertilizing daffodils, as they said in Dead Poets Society. Right.
Well, and it's funny, you talk about how things hold up and kind of how you decide what holds up for you. We actually just recorded our podcast episode for the movie The Wizard with Fred Savage.
Yeah.
And I made the stupid mistake. We have a little segment kind of we do towards the end of the show after we've talked for a little bit, where we do 5 questions, and those 5 questions, a little bit similar to kind of some of the Daily Show 5 questions back in the day. But we do a 5 questions that are kind of loosely related to the topic we're on. And I made the stupid mistake of asking the other guys to give me their top 3 video games of all time.
Mm-hmm.
That was a dumb question.
Was that like 2 hours of discussion following what had come before on the show, or?
Pretty much. It was about 3 hours of me sitting down that afternoon and going, dear God, why did I ask this question? Because I started to list out, I'm like, okay, let's start with my very first, my dad used to work for Texas Instruments. We had the TI 99 4A computer.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, let me start to list out all the games I loved in that one. So I'm starting to list them out. And then I'm like, okay, well, then we had a Nintendo. Okay, let me list out the NES. Okay, Super Nintendo. So I started to list those out. And before I realized it, the first draft of my list is about 60 games long.
Wow.
And I'm like, okay, well, that's not going to work because I said 3. So then I think I narrowed it down to 20. And once I got down to 20, the other guys have made fun of me because I use one of those, I've never worked in business. I'm a teacher, so I do my English teachery stuff. But there's a chart that somebody I know who kind of works in business gave me one time called a paired decision chart. And it's how now if I want to, because I need to make myself a little bit more objective when I say, okay, let me rank my top whatever. And so I tortured myself by putting these 20 movies into this paired decision chart and ranked. What you end up doing is you compare each one to every other one on the list and decide which one you like better.
Yeah.
And then ultimately you get down to it and you count up the number of points each thing got. And then whichever has the most points obviously is number 1, and then 2, 3, and so on. And my results came out fine. But my problem was when I'm looking at that list and I'm comparing the games, it's kind of like what you said, that it's a little bit unfair to compare certain things. You know, when you compare LA Law with Breaking Bad, you can't really do that. I mean, you can, I guess, a little bit. But what the problem I was running into was I had games that I loved as a kid. I had Super Mario Brothers. I had Q*bert. I had, what were some of the other ones? Legend of Zelda. I had Street Fighter 2. I had all those games, the Ninja Turtles arcade game. All that stuff that I loved as a kid was on that list, but it was also next to games that I've played within the last 10 years that I'm like, okay, well, Battlefield 1, just this beautiful cinematic game for the PlayStation 4. I loved that game when I played it. Now, how in God's green earth do I go about comparing how much as a kid I was just gleeful about playing A Boy and His Blob for the Nintendo Entertainment System?
Oh yeah, man. Love that game.
Versus NBA 2K19 or whatever I'm playing today. I love both of them. You know, Civilization 4 is my kryptonite. That's the one that I think came out top in my list. But like, how do I compare that with something that as a kid, if you had tried to get me to turn off the TV, I would have screamed at you. How do I make that comparison? Because I love both of them, but for very different reasons.
Yeah, you can't get mad at a horse for not being a jet plane. Like you kind of got to view it as a horse.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, so that was a stupid question that I asked.
No, it was not a stupid question. I just think like I think we have to ask these things, because or else we're stuck in this high fidelity infinite loop where like the conversation never gets any deeper than like ranking stuff and arguing with other people's way of ranking stuff.
Right.
And you know, if that was all there was to say about movies 30 years later, well, we wouldn't be talking about them 30 years later. Their significance is greater than that. I mean, that's why I wrote the book in the first place. You commit yourself to 3 years of Goonies trivia with fans all across this great land, which is what I did while I was on tour. You got to believe there's something to these movies, and that was what I was trying to convey in this book, that they endure not because of how we remember them, but because of how we feel about them now.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that kind of leads me into another question I was going to bring up with you. I had seen a little while back, and it was kind of, it's not to say that it's gone away at all, but it seemed like it was a little bit more prominent, earlier last year. You had written a blog post back in April about Molly Ringwald's Me Too essay in the New Yorker.
Uh-huh.
And this one has kind of come up several times on our show too. And at different times we've had some strong opinions about it, but I guess kind of the idea of reevaluating movies that we love kind of based on a modern lens, can they or should they exist in a bubble of their original time and setting? So I guess the ultimate question is it antithetical to support the Me Too movement or something like that and still enjoy 16 Candles or Animal House? And I know you already kind of started to mention this earlier, but what are kind of your thoughts on that?
No, it's not antithetical, and you can understand something comes from a time and place that may be less enlightened than it is now, and still enjoy it. I wouldn't choose to model one's life after it, just like I wouldn't like walk around pretending to be Rhett Butler or Shaft or something like that. Visions of masculinity that are hardly progressive or view equality between the genders equally. But that doesn't mean I can't enjoy those things for what they are. I don't think Miss Ringwald in her essay was saying like never watch The Breakfast Club again, or feel ashamed of yourself for liking that movie. She was just saying like understand where this movie came from and what it's saying, and that chances are most people who were teenagers when The Breakfast Club came out now have teenagers of their own, and be willing to watch this movie and enjoy it with your kids based on where we are now as a culture. And I think that's an important thing to state, even if it's kind of an enduring truism, that like that's what makes a classic, that we continue to come back to it generation after generation and get something new out of it each time. The Great Gatsby, came out in 1925, and nobody gave a shit about it until World War II, a generation later. So does that mean we were, when it became a classic, we were supposed to say, well, that's about the Jazz Age and things are different now, and and people dress differently, and that was during Prohibition, and therefore like we shouldn't like it as much? No, I mean we view things in light of when they came out, and in our distance from them at the same time. I mean, that's the whole premise of this podcast, right?
Right.
Should we not consider at all what it's saying in light of what we know in 2019? No.
Yeah. I think a lot of that kind of came up as well around the time that there was, I think, came out in the news not too long ago about the Little House on the Prairie books and how some of those books were being either banned or removed from places because of some of the language that's used to refer to Native Americans or other groups. Mm-hmm. And I know that the initial knee-jerk reaction from my family in particular was, that's ridiculous. We've read all these books. Our kids love these books. There's such a great message to these books. Are people just throwing the baby out with the bathwater when they take a look at that and say, well, this is how they referred to these groups of peoples, and therefore we shouldn't read them anymore? So I think that was kind of one of the initial knee-jerk reactions from my family, was to say, whoa. We've read all these books. We love these books. Is there some stuff in it that we wouldn't accept in today's society? Absolutely. But that's when we have a conversation with our kids while we're reading them, and we say, okay, now you're gonna hear some words in this book, and this is the way people used to talk. This is not the way that's acceptable to talk now.
Indeed. And I think what you're putting your finger on, it comes down to sort of hanging at the background of this is the question of role modeling. Like we don't worry about what's in the Laura Ingalls Wilder books if generations of young girls have not wanted to model themselves after the adventures of Laura Ingalls Wilder. And um, as such, we need to be careful of when these books were written and what they're saying because all readers wish to see them, all readers and all moviegoers wish to see themselves in fiction to some degree, and therefore will identify with the experiences they see, whether or not whether or not they are kind and open-hearted or bigoted and closed-minded. Um, and at the same time, like particularly for kids, we need to encourage kids to not just identify with people who look like them. I can't tell you the number of times like I would meet people while I was on book tour and they were saying like, and they would say like, oh, well, I have sons, so therefore I can't show them Pretty in Pink because that's a girl's movie and they're not going to identify it with. And I'm like, are you crazy? Like I was all over Pretty in Pink when I was 13. And I have a feeling your sons are smarter than that. I think that is a trap we fall in. That I don't have kids, so I can't say we, but I think it's a trap parents fall into. That in the course of shoring up a kid's identity, they only want to show them pop culture that looks like them, and I think that's really selling short the power that pop culture has.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the other things I want to ask you, there was, as I was reading Brat Pack America, there was one line in particular that that really kind of jumped out at me. And I think it might've been because I had just seen a movie that had come out that the two thoughts really, for me, kind of tied together. The line in your book is, and I think it was in one of the first couple of chapters, talking about John Hughes movies and how he treats the teenage characters in his movies. And the line you wrote was, they give dignity to teenagers while showing how hard it can be for teenagers to give dignity to themselves. And I think for me, as someone who works in a middle school, and I work with kids that are, they're in that really ultra awkward age of sixth grade through eighth grade. They're not elementary kids, but they're not high school yet. I read that, and round about the time that I read that, I had also just seen the movie Eighth Grade. And have you seen that movie?
I have.
Okay. And being someone who works in a middle school and has worked closely with eighth grade children for years and years and years, that movie there were so many parts to that movie that made me so excited. It made me feel like I was watching a piece of what my life had gone into. And so much of it is heartbreaking because I've seen this happen so many times to kids in real life. So I know in your book, most of the teen 80s movies that you've talked about, and most teen 80s movies are, dealing with high schoolers, but you've seen Eighth Grade.
Yeah.
Is there to me, Eighth Grade felt like maybe not quite a John Hughes movies, but it felt like the way he gave dignity to teenagers the way you worded that.
Yeah, I mean, I think like it would be. I was kind of meh on Eighth Grade. Like I think Eighth Grade is a great performance in search of a movie.
Okay.
I think I kind of think there's no movie there. There's a fantastic central performance, and then the rest of it is kind of a series of acting exercises, which show how effectively these actors portray the sort of daily dramas of the eighth grade. But and maybe this is just me being like a 45-year-old old fuddy-duddy, but kind of nothing happens in that movie. And I don't mean I need something to explode. I just mean there's no beginning, middle, and end. It's sort of it is simply a series of ideas loosely strung together. And I think so I guess my question is always, when people say they love that movie, I always ask, do you love something about it beyond the fact that it does a very good job conveying the feeling of eighth grade?
Mm-hmm. I'll preface. I mean, I'll clarify that and say, I agree with you. I loved her performance.
Mm-hmm.
And the other part of it too, I love the performances. I love the performance of her dad and just how awkward he is in that
Mm-hmm.
movie. Because I've seen parents try to deal with their own eighth grade children, and I've got one that's going to be an eighth grader in just a couple of years. So,
Oh man,
God help me, I know what it's going to be like.
uh-huh.
But yeah, no, I agree with you because part of it almost seemed to me like this movie, and not to badmouth eighth graders, but I've read enough eighth grade writing to know that it kind of felt like the story was developed with an eighth grade sensibility.
Yeah, yeah, and that was really the genius of John Hughes. Like, I'm always very careful when people say, "Oh, did you see X movie that just came out? It reminds me of a John Hughes movie." And usually, what that means is the movie features teenagers, and it's not, American Pie. Um, and really, I think that undersells like the genius of John Hughes, which was John Hughes was like already in his 30s when he was making movies about teenagers. Like he was most definitely old enough to be the parent of most of the people in those movies. If not the parent, like the sort of distant older brother or older cousin. And yet he so understood how young people thought and felt and acted that the movie succeeds at being about young people and yet not so close to the subject that it has no perspective on young people. It succeeds in still being a movie and not simply diary entries.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's like the great teen films of the modern age, and believe me, there are plenty of them, succeed in doing that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think her performance in particular, just it really kind of made me think of the ways that, well, I think the way you said it in your book was summed it up perfectly. The dignity that you're giving to these characters that nobody really ever gave to teenagers before.
Yeah, I mean, and that is something that, like, the teen movie had been around since since we in American popular culture had a conception of teenagers. So the teen movie goes back at least as far as like rock and roll, or like the days, the era portrayed in, say, Happy Days.
Mhm.
However, in pretty much until the 1980s, the teen movie was always viewed teenagers as kind of a species of fish inside an aquarium. Um, it viewed them as symbols of something, or a social problem, or via the lens of adulthood. They were kind of never able or allowed to be fully formed human beings themselves. And really beginning with a movie like Breaking Away, in which I believe was 78 or 79. And then on through, Valley Girl and My Bodyguard and Fast Times at Ridgemont High, reaching an apex with John Hughes in 84 with 16 Candles and 85 with Breakfast Club. You really get movies that where teenagers are fully formed human beings, number one, and number two, the story is told from their point of view. There is no adult kind of weighing in on the narrative or on the plot. It belongs exclusively to young people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that was, and you name dropped a whole bunch of different movies. That was one of the other things in reading your book, that as I'm reading it, I'm going, oh my God, my watch list is now so much longer because I haven't seen this one and I haven't seen this one. And I remember it was just a few weeks ago, I was going to jump on Letterboxd. I know you're on Letterboxd as well.
Oh yeah, it's like it's like the greatest website ever. It's like Goodreads for movies. Like,
I know. So I jumped on there and I'm like, I use Letterboxd. I paid for the pro registration. I need to make a list to keep track of like all the movies that he's mentioning in this book, so I can go through and make sure that I watch all of them. And God bless, I don't remember the person's name, but God bless the person who already made that list when I logged in and found it. And I'm like, okay, you have now saved me hours of time.
I'm not quite remembering who that person was either, but I was incredibly flattered. The my favorite, like among like my favorite comments I get when people read the books is oh, now I have like 30 movies I need to watch. I have such an incredible queue now, and I'm like, good. Like I've done my job. Like if you never pick up the book again, I still feel like I've done my job.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was putting together a presentation for something I had to do actually earlier today, a couple weeks ago, and sometimes when I'm putting together something and it's, I'm at a point where it's just putting in pictures or doing something like that where I don't have to be completely focused on it. I'll put a movie on in the background, and I'm looking around for movies, and I don't remember which site I was on, whether it was Netflix or one of the others, and I come across The Warriors, and I'm like,
oh, Jesus.
I've never seen The Warriors, but that's like one of the first movies he mentions in the book. Let me give it a watch. And so I put the movie on, and no joke, that presentation never got done.
Just kind of sunk its claws into you, huh?
It just, I'm starting to watch it. I'm like, it's one of those older, it's what was it, 79? It's one of those I'll put on the background, and it was not one that I could put on in the background. I started it and like, well, the premise of this movie is so simple. They got to get home without getting killed by the other gangs. This is not something that I need to be like fully 100% investing my attention into. I can have it on while I'm working, and that did not work at all. So, so I will thank you for introducing me to The Warriors. I had seen it before, or I had seen the poster before. I was aware of it. I'd seen it in video stores, the VHS cover in video stores, but had never watched it up until a couple weeks ago. And I'm like, okay, great. I'm not getting any work done now.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, is it a great movie like on its own? No.
Right.
Is it a great movie for the influence that it's had on popular culture? Oh yeah. Like first of all, it's in like one of every 5 hip hop songs.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been sampled. It is the basis for an above average Xbox game.
Yeah.
Which was really fun. The Warriors Xbox game was really a lot of fun. And if you like movies about street gangs, which I do, like that's a great one. If you ever wondered what the Beastie Boys were talking about when they always talk, or Wu-Tang Clan, when they talked about baseball furies, like it's in there too. And if you like there's a whole genre of like 70s New York, like New York was a real S-hole in the 70s or so.
Mm-hmm.
Or so the movies would have us believe. Like it's one of the, like that and Taxi Driver are like some of the best examples of that kind of movie.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you this now, since we've got you on now, and this is being 2019 when we're recording this. Obviously, for our show, for our purposes, it's 1989. So we're nearing the end. We started in the middle of the 80s. We're nearing the end of our 80s decade. And as of next year, when it's 2020, we'll be starting in the 1990s. So shifting from, and I know that there's a little bit of a kind of an overlap between the decades. It's kind of always the way when you've got movies that you go from the 70s to the 80s and the 80s to the 90s. But now that we're kind of reaching the end of our journey through the 80s and next year going into the 90s, what do you see as being one of the biggest differences between those two decades in terms of film? And then is there a 90s movie we would be remiss in not covering in the next decade?
Oh, Jesus, man. There's so many. I mean, so for my story, for the story of 80s teen movies I was trying to tell in Brat Pack America, there is a logical ending. And you're not always presented with something like that. When if you were like, oh, I want to do a book about 80s action movies, like what's the last one? I don't know. I mean, maybe I'd say Die Hard, or maybe I'd say like The Fugitive. The Fugitive is 1989, but really feels like, wait, is The Fugitive 1989? The Fugitive's a little later than that.
I think it's early 90s, I think.
Yeah. But in the case of 80s teen movies, there is a logical ending, and it's Heathers. Like Heathers is the movie that literally blows up the genre.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of when a genre, produces its own satire, you can safely say that the genre's moment in the sun has passed.
Mm-hmm.
That it's now kitsch and maybe coming around to nostalgia rather than contemporary. And I think what Heathers does, even though it is a swipe at the John Hughes 80s teen movie, it also, like, even though the people who made it couldn't have known, it also predicts some of the pop culture cliches of the 1990s. You know, it has an ambiguous ending. It has an anti-hero. It has heavy black eyeliner. It has a sort of surreal, creepy soundtrack. The 90s was very much from a movie standpoint, the 90s was very much about like certain things. It was about broken families, like you look at, or the idea of friends as family. You know, you look at movies like Reality Bites and Dazed and Confused early in the decade, or movies like American Beauty at the end of the decade. The 90s was very much about ambiguous endings. You look at a movie like Say Anything, which is another movie about broken families, but I contend is even though it came out in the summer of 1989, is really a 90s teen movie, and not just because it takes place in Seattle. It's a movie about broken families and ambiguous endings, and no sort of the 80s teen movie. In fact, most 80s movies end on kind of a definitive note. The only exception would be kind of the alternative 80s teen movies, the ones that were doppelgangers to the John Hughes movies like Over the Edge and Repo Man and The Legend of Billie Jean, which were all sort of dark pictures of what it meant to be a teenager in America at that time. Also, you know, the 90s movies are about the coming of the internet and the blurring of geographic boundaries, you know, and not just in obvious examples, movies like Hackers and you know, and The Net and stuff like that. But at the end of the decade, you have all of these movies like The Matrix and The Game, which are all about like the world is not what you think it is. And that's about the growing influence of the internet and also the coming of Y2K. And you know, at the same time, you know, the 90s was also a time of unparalleled economic prosperity for at least the last 7 years of it. So we see that in the optimism of many of those movies too. The return of the youth movie, you know, beginning with Clueless in the summer of 1995, is very much about this return to the idea that the future will belong to the young, you know, in good ways and bad ways. You know, even in the dark versions of that movie, like Cruel Intentions, you know, there's still an idea that like this 300-year-old French classic of French literature can be repurposed, and teenagers can do that too. Like, right. So yeah, I think it's. I mean, I think the 90s as a decade for movies is just as fascinating as the 80s for the movie as a way of to study the movies of that decade. Who knows? Maybe I'll do that someday.
Yeah. Well, we've been kind of funny about when we started the podcast. One of the guys that's on the show, he's our band director here at the middle school, and he just gets very excited, like sometimes overly excited about action movies. And he just when we had, it was one of our first episodes that we ever recorded in 2015, and I said, hey, you know, guys, we're just starting out with this podcast. What are you guys excited for? And I was kind of expecting, you know, them to say, well, Back to the Future and, you know, Commando and stuff that we were doing in that first year. And he just straight looks at me and goes, Batman. And I said, Pat, we're not going to get to Batman until 2019. It's going to be like 4 years. I was like, yep, that's the one I'm excited for.
How about that?
Okay. So now we're looking ahead to all the 80s stuff. I love all the 80s stuff too. But one of my favorite movies is The Rocketeer.
Oh yeah, man.
And that was kind of my answer, you know, in the last couple years or so. I'm like, I'm excited to get to The Rocketeer. And they're like, well, you realize that's early 90s. We're not going to get to that for several years. I'm like, I don't care. Pat wants Batman. I want The Rocketeer. Well, this is delayed gratification. We can get there. We're just fine. I really looking forward to kind of moving on into the 90s, and I know that the early part of the 90s obviously will have some similarities that'll kind of bleed over from the 80s as well. But then you kind of, as you said, you kind of start to get into those movies that are distinctively have that 90s flavor to them.
Yeah, and you know, just to make a quick point about action movies at that time, there's a really profound shift. You know, of course, we have the ending of the Cold War at the end of the 1980s. So and that has something to do, and the sort of leftward turn politically of the country, with the election of Bill Clinton in 1992. um, the 90s, the 80s action movie, the action hero is almost always a representative of the system, is a cop or a federal agent or something like that. And when you move into the 90s, the action hero is almost always against the system.
Mm-hmm.
See Richard Kimball in The Fugitive, or Neo in The Matrix. That's a really, I think it's a subtle shift, but it sort of puts that whole genre under glass, and really draws a pretty sharp line between then and now.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm really looking forward to that. So we've kind of reached one of our last segments of the show, and it's we do have 5 questions, and they're kind of rapid fire, but sometimes we talk a little bit more than you would expect to talk for rapid fire questions. So
I will rapid fire if that's what you want.
There's not a time limit, so don't worry about this being rapid fire. But 5 kind of final questions, and some of these are maybe a little bit more hypothetical than than some of the questions we've talked about so far. But so here are our 5 questions for this time around.
He asks each traveler 5 questions.
It's impossible to answer.
Impossible because you don't know the answer.
Nobody could answer that question.
You've got to ask yourself one question.
What are you asking me for? I don't know.
What you've just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
Question number 1, is there a single movie that you feel encapsulates the 80s for you?
Oh God, that's really hard. I mean, like there are sort of obviously, like, stupidly obvious answers, like Wall Street,
Mm-hmm.
or the Breakfast Club is kind of a stupidly obvious answer. The Breakfast Club is about 5 kids in detention. It really could have taken place at any time in history. Right. I don't know. Like, my inclination, just off the top of my head, would be to say Tron. Okay. Which feels to me like a movie about the sort of increasing presence of technology in our lives. And in a dazzling way and in a scary way too. I guess it feels very much of the early 1980s because it's about arcade games. But I also feel like it's very much of that time and ahead of its time, which is remarkable. I haven't seen the remake, and I don't particularly feel the need to see the remake. I've listened to the Daft Punk soundtrack about 1,000 times, and that's more than enough for me.
That's probably all you need to do.
Yeah.
All right. Question number 2. Which of the Breakfast Club members would you have been in high school?
Oh, none of them. And that's not evading the question. That's just because I went to like a weird high school. I went to a private progressive school that was founded in the 1960s, and the whole thing was like, we're not like those public schools. We're different and artsy and creative, and kids can be themselves. Except it was like the tail end of the Reagan era, and kids could most definitely not be themselves. So I think I was certainly not popular, and I was certainly not a jock, even though I was on the tennis team. But we sort of didn't have nerds in a conventional sense of the word, because we had a dress code, and you had to take a test to go to this school. So everybody was kind of at least nerd curious. So God, I don't know. I guess that's why I felt like I never identified with any of the people in that movie, as much as I love that movie, and I've seen it, 65 times. That was more the fault of where I went to school than any sort of conscious avoidance on my part.
Sure. So the school you went to, would it be fair to say it's maybe like a more updated version of a Dead Poets Society?
No. Okay. We were a Midwestern school, first of all, and so we didn't have any of the sort of social capital weight of being an East Coast prep school. It had only been around since the 1960s, and it was in a university town. I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So it was not the place where like the brand of the school was not we send your best and brightest here, like with Welton Academy in Dead Poet Society. God, it felt like in retrospect, it felt a little bit more like the high school in like 10 Things I Hate About You.
Okay.
That I guess is the best comparison I could make.
Okay. Yeah, I when I lived in England, obviously I was much younger, but when I lived in England, I had the option to go to an American school there, and decided, well, we're only here for a few years. Let's go to the British school in the town. And when I got to eventually when we moved back here to the States and we read Lord of the Flies in high school, I'm like, yep, nope, I know exactly why this book is structured the way it is. I know exactly. I know these characters. I went to school with some of these characters. So yeah, the idea of slightly different setup for going to school, I connected with in that sense too, since I had been to a slightly different middle school than the kids even I teach here.
Yeah, I will say that like one of the great things about writing a book is you get a chance to like, brag about it in certain settings. And one of the things I've done a couple of times is like address an assembly of my high school, which is an awesome thing. It's a little bit like, the ugly, I felt like the ugly duckling who became a swan, but I think like as much as I like don't look fondly upon my years in high school, I also feel like things turned out kind of okay as an adult. So I've elected not to waste energy regretting those days, and I'm actually friends with a number of people like I had little to no relationship with in high school. I'm friends with them as adults, which is pretty great.
That's nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's with the advent of this year is my wife and I, we went to high school together, and this year is our 20th high school reunion. And we're kind of finding that we haven't really done any other reunions before this just because Facebook.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, the first high school reunion I went to was my 15th, and I only did that because I was on tour for my first book for Bookmark Now, and I happened to be nearby. I was doing a gig in Toronto, and so I'm like, yeah, if there's an ideal time to go to one's high school reunion, it's like when you're on tour as a published author. And so I went and I had a great time, and I've subsequently done a few other high school reunions since then, simply because it worked for me.
Yeah.
And then I've just kept in touch with the people who were nearby and I've wanted to keep in touch with.
Yeah. So question number 3, if you were to quantum leap yourself into a character from any story, could be TV, movie, book, and try to help them fix something that's messed up about their life, who would it be?
Oh, I'm a huge fan of the movie House Party.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like that movie, like the thing that makes that movie go is like kid didn't know how to kid sort of didn't respect the fact that his dad worked 2 jobs because his mom was dead, and kid was a smart guy. Like I don't know why he didn't just do his homework and hang out with his friends and write rap lyrics. It really struck me that he had time for all of those things, and he just sort of kept fumbling, kept sort of defying his dad's wishes, even though he didn't really have to. So I'd probably sit down with kid and be like, dude, you're a senior and you're a smart kid and you're going to go off to college. You're going to get to throw as many house parties as you want. Just play the long game, man.
That sounds like so many conversations I have with my own child, and he's only 11. All right. Question number 4. Actually, this is something that you tweeted earlier today. I happened to be on Twitter for a little bit, and I saw that you tweeted this earlier today. You said, when you're born to a town with no real cuisine of its own, all the world is your buffet. You've stayed in Chicago for a while. What's your favorite meal to eat in Chicago?
Oh, that is a hard one, man. Like I haven't even begun with Chicago. Like I'm to eat my way across Chicago. Like yeah. I'm a really
there's a reason why people are bigger in Chicago.
Yes. Yes, and Chicago is a tremendous food town, and I live in San Francisco, which is like one of America's food capitals, and yet I still come to Chicago with certain meals in mind. Um, my sort of regular go-to Chicago places are all about like neighborhoods where my friends have lived. So I had a friend who lived in Wicker Park for many years, which meant I ate at Lily's barbecue like 50 times and still try and go back there. My best friend lives in Andersonville, so I've spent a lot of time at like Big Jones's Soul Food and at the Coffee Studio and at the Hop Leaf Brewery over there. Um, my favorite soul food restaurant on the south side of town is no longer there, so I'll have to find another one of those. Um, I really like the Rick Bayless Mexican foods, even though like the last thing I need coming from Northern California is Mexican food in Illinois, but I do it anyway. Um, and and Chicago's a great breakfast town too. There's some pancake joint over on Rush Street that's been more than good to me on several occasions. I'm not remember the name of it. Um, and God, I could just go on like the firecracker donut or the coffee from the breakfast from Goddess and the Baker downtown and all over the city, and their like nitro brew iced coffee in like a beer mug or a tall beer glass. Like Jesus, like why are we talking? Like why didn't we just meet somewhere in Chicago the next time I was there and like over one of these meals? Like,
Hey, I'm good with that. Next time you're here, let me know.
Please, I'm completely distracted now. So.
Well, that's what I made sure I had to have some dinner before we started talking, because I'm like, I've got that question in there, and as soon as somebody starts talking food, I didn't have lunch today, so I know I'm going to get hungry, so I got to eat something real fast. But yeah.
Chicago's an amazing place to sit down and eat.
Well, I watch that. Every once in a while, WGN has the show on later at night called Chicago's Best, and they go through and they do some of the different. They pick a style of food and they jump around the city and go to places that people have recommended. And I just watch that show and I'm just like, why do I not get out more often? Like, so many. It's kind of like reading your book and having to put down that watch list and say, okay, now I've got like 50 more things. I watch those shows, or I watch the what was the one that President Obama was on before he was president? I think it was called Check Please or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they have three people, come in and they each pick a restaurant, and the other people go to the restaurant, and then everybody reviews it afterwards. And I watch those shows, and I'm just like, there's not enough money or days of the week or meals in a day, and there's just an embarrassment of riches.
You're absolutely right. And from where you are over in what's it called in Lake Forest, you get on the train and in 35 minutes you're at the Ravenswood stop, and that'll take you just about anywhere from there. Like
some great, my wife and I love Indian food, and there's some great spots on Devon, and we went to some great Middle Eastern bakeries a little while back, and just there wasn't enough room in our house to bring home all the bread I wanted to bring home, but yeah.
Yeah, no kidding. Like there's it's a blessing to the point of distraction.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So yes, as an addendum to question number 4, the next time you're in town, let me know and we can meet up somewhere. And
I dig that.
We'll have to narrow it down. I can get you one of those paired decision charts, and we can narrow down the best place to go.
Excellent.
It may take 3 hours, but we'll narrow it down. So last question 5. What is so you've written Brat Pack America. You've written a couple of books at this point. What is the book that you want to write that you haven't written yet?
I love usually the answer to that is just like whatever I'm working on next. And
Mm-hmm.
I have this idea for a book about women filmmakers that I'm really excited about. But like taking the long view and looking like out over the vast stretch of time, like I love to read essay collections, and I have yet to write an essay collection, and I want to. I hope to before my time is up. And I love to interview people. So I have a number of essay ideas like Ideally, I'd like to do one essay collection about all the different sectors of pop culture I love. One about music, one about movies, one about video games, one about books, that sort of thing. And then pair each of them with like a collection of interviews with, I think, great but unknown practitioners in those genres. I'd love to spend a year interviewing film composers or book jacket designers or music, music engineers or session musicians or something like that. I think the way culture is produced involves so many people and doing so many wondrous things, and we all too often get lost in just what the sort of entertainment press tells us to pay attention to, and it's just deeper and wider and better than that. So
Yeah. Now, have you in the collections of things that I was looking at in your bibliography, have you ever written fiction, or are you kind of purely I'm a nonfiction guy?
I'm a nonfiction person. I don't have those skills. I mean, I've to be fair, I've never really tried, but I kind of feel like this world is dazzling and fascinating enough for me. I don't have the urge to create other ones.
Yeah. Yeah. Well put. All right. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for coming on, spending some time with us here on the show, and it was great to finally connect with you. Having read the book and just the insights you had on particularly the John Hughes movies. We've just done a whole bunch of them in the last couple of years on the show, and then just getting to discover some realms of the '80s teen movies in particular that I had not spent a whole lot of time in, and it's just great to get to read your books. And then when I was looking up and seeing the other one, the 50 reasons to pick up the 50 books you read in high school, I'm like, okay, that sounds like a summer reading list I made for myself several years ago, and I never got even a quarter of the way through. So I need to go back to that, and maybe your book can help me, because that was
I certainly hope so.
Yeah, because it was something where I sat down. I was like, you know what? I'm an English teacher, and there are some great American, not just American, but there's great works of literature that I haven't read. And to say that I'm an English teacher and that I haven't read Catch-22, or I haven't read any Stephen King books or anything like that at this point, I have to sit down and I have to make a list, and I'm going to read these books over the course of a summer. And I think I maybe got 3 books in between kids and life and other stuff. I was just like, no, I don't have the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you.
I think I need to check out your book and go take a look and see, what I can get myself caught up in. Because I know several of the books that you mentioned are ones that I've taught over the years. So I'm like, okay, I'm good with those. I don't need to be convinced that I need to pick those up, because I know they're amazing. But there are several that I know that I have missed in my career as an English teacher. I'm like, I can't in good conscience call myself an English teacher and not have read some of these books.
Yeah, I understand. Like I think you and your all too common conundrum was exactly whom I wrote that book for.
Yeah.
Thankfully, Practical Classics and Brat Pack America, the love letter to '80s teen movie, are both available. Are both available at a fine book retailer, or in person or online near you.
And Chicago is another place that has some great bookstores. So
God, it sure does. It sure does. The amount of time and fortune I have gladly surrendered at places like Open Books and Myopic and Women and Children First and Jesus, I could just go on and on and on. Like, yeah, great bookstores in Chicago.
Yeah. Oh yeah. All right. Well, so your books are available there. Where can people typically find you online?
Oh, kevinsmokler.com. That's SMOKLER. And Twitter, Ouija, WEEGEE. That's where I spend most of my social media time.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah. Thank you again so much for being on the show. And it was just a pleasure to get to talk to you for a little bit. And hopefully, maybe as we go through some of the '90s, we can get you back on and talk through some '90s stuff as well. And as soon as one of your next books comes out, then get you on and talk about that one as well. Because I guarantee I'm going to go find it, because I have determined that I am your demographic. So
Well, I'd enjoy that very much, and thank you for inviting me, John.
Absolutely. So if anybody else wants to go find more about our show, go to 30podcast.com. That's 30podcast.com. That's got all the different ways you can find us: Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Our voicemail line is there if you want to call in and leave a message. We'll play it on the show and respond to it. Our next episode's coming up. We've got some great movies coming up. If you want to get ahead of the game, we have our next episode finishes off our month of sports movies. It is the Rutger Hauer movie, The Blood of Heroes. So that one is coming up next. That'll be just probably in a few short days after this episode is posted up. And then we go into our month of March. And in March, we are taking a look at Glory. Then for the next couple weeks after that, we're in Tom Hanks mode. We've got The Burbs and Turner and Hooch. Then we finish off the month with The War of the Roses. And at some point in there, I know my daughter is dying to go see Captain Marvel when it comes out. So I know it's not an 80s movie, but we're going to go see Captain Marvel. And I guarantee we will do a podcast on that one once it comes out. So if you are wanting to kind of catch some of these movies ahead of time before you listen to the show, that's what we got coming up. Blood of Heroes, Glory, The Burbs, Turner and Hooch, War of the Roses. Kevin, is there any one of those, as you hear that list, are there any one of those that you're like, that one?
Glory is one of my favorite movies of all time.
Okay. We used to, I know we used to show kind of an edited version here at the middle school when we had the kids kind of going through the Civil War period. So it's one I've haven't seen in a few years, but it's one I've seen many, many, many times. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking about that one.
Absolutely.
Again, Kevin, thank you so much for being with us. And I will sign off as I always do and say, everybody out there, we will see you back here next time. Be excellent to each other and go watch some good movies.